The Penrose broke through the outer thermosphere of Kepler 882b at 0317 ship time, and Commander Yara Osei was already awake, already dressed, already standing at the observation window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. She had not slept in 31 hours. She did not intend to. Below her, the planet hung like something that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. From orbit it had seemed simple enough. The survey drone sent 3 months earlier had captured images of a world with 2 large continents, amber-brown landmasses separated by a shallow equatorial sea the color of oxidized copper. Breathable atmosphere. Gravity at 0.94 standard. Surface temperature ranging from -12 to +42 Celsius. No large megafauna detected. A dozen varieties of something vaguely plant-like, bioluminescent at night, chlorophyll-adjacent in their metabolic signatures. Nothing to suggest anything remarkable. But that had been 3 months ago. What Yara looked at now bore no resemblance to those survey images. The northern continent, which they had catalogued as landmass alpha, which the crew had informally started calling the shelf, was still recognizable, more or less. Its general shape remained. But its surface had changed in ways that the survey instruments registered as errors, flagged, re-registered, and then simply stopped trying to explain. The southeastern quarter of the shelf appeared to be composed of crystalline structures, enormous ones, spires of something translucent and blue-white rising kilometers into the sky, scattering the light of Kepler 882 in prismatic fans across the upper atmosphere. The northwestern quarter looked almost terrestrial, forests of deep green, rolling hills, the silvery thread of rivers, except that the rivers ran upward in several places, water climbing into the air in leisurely spirals before dispersing as fine mist in the upper thermals. The central region was something else entirely, a flat, absolutely featureless plane of uniform gray that the instruments registered as neither solid nor liquid nor gas, but something they categorized, helplessly, as undifferentiated matter state. The southern continent, landmass beta, the basin, was worse. Or more interesting, depending on your disposition. It had 3 distinct zones visible even from orbit, each bounded by a sharp, almost geometrically clean line, as though someone had drawn borders with a ruler. One zone burned with perpetual orange fire that did not appear to consume anything and cast no heat detectable from orbit. One zone existed in apparent permanent night despite being in full daylight, a circle of darkness that tracked the sun but refused it. One zone looked completely normal, rolling terrain, scattered vegetation, except that objects in it moved. Not living things. Rocks. Boulders. The survey footage from 3 months ago showed the same stones in different positions each frame, not drifting, not sliding, but relocating, as though between one moment and the next they simply chose to be somewhere else. "Beautiful," said Dr. von Casimir, appearing at Yara's shoulder without sound, which was his particular talent. He was the mission's xenobiologist, 44 years old, with the gentle eyes of someone who had spent his career being astonished. He was holding his own cold coffee. I counted 14 physically incompatible phenomena from the survey analysis alone. I stopped counting because it was making me feel inadequate. "The crew brief is in 20 minutes, Yara said. "I know. I've been up for 32 hours preparing it. I'm going to tell them almost nothing, because almost everything we think we know is wrong." He paused. "Which is, in a way, liberating. You're a strange man, Thon." "The planet agrees with me," he said, and gestured at the window. The Penrose carried 22 people. A crew of 8 for ship operations, 6 scientists across disciplines, xenobiology, geology, atmospheric chemistry, xenolinguistics, exobotany, physics, and 8 mission specialists who occupied a bureaucratic category that included 2 military observers, 3 corporate liaisons from Kepler Consolidated Resources, a documentary filmmaker named Marisol Vega who had spent the last 4 months shooting footage of people sleeping and eating and staring out windows, and 2 figures whose actual roles remained diplomatically vague, a philosopher-ethicist named Tobias Renk and a systems theorist named Dr. Amara Solis. Yara had resented Tobias and Amara at the start of the mission. A philosopher. A systems theorist. 12 months in transit, and the funding consortium had allocated 2 bunk slots to people who, as far as she could determine, produced no tangible outputs. Tobias had spent the journey reading and writing in paper notebooks with a fountain pen like some kind of affectation. Amara had spent it building extremely complex models in a visualization software, projections of branching systems that covered the walls of her cabin and made the corridor outside it feel like walking through someone's feverish dream. Watching the planet below, Yara found herself thinking that she owed both of them an apology. The crew briefing took place in the central bay, which doubled as a dining area, which tripled as the only space large enough to fit all 22 of them without someone sitting on the equipment lockers. Yara stood at the front. Behind her, a holographic display showed the planet in real-time orbital imaging, and the real-time imaging made the room go quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something outside language tries to enter. "I'm going to tell you what we know," Yara said. "It won't take long, because it isn't much." She paused. The planet's surface has undergone dramatic structural and physical changes since the survey drones documented it 93 days ago. The magnitude and nature of those changes are inconsistent with any geological, meteorological, chemical, or biological process in our reference database. That's the first thing. The second thing is this: Dr. Casimir's analysis of the change patterns suggests they are not random. A hand went up. Lieutenant Commander Dawa Yangchen, her XO, practical and precise. Not random in what sense? The changes cluster, Fan said, taking a step forward. He had a quiet authority in scientific discussions that Yara had always appreciated. Each of the 14 distinct zones we've identified on the surface represents a physically consistent internal logic. Within any given zone, the physics are coherent. Gravity works the same way throughout the crystalline zone, it's just not the same way gravity works here. The fire zone follows thermodynamic rules, just different thermodynamic rules. Each zone is, internally, a working universe. They simply aren't the same universe as each other. "How is that possible?" said Corporate Liaison Hendricks, a broad man with a compressed mouth who had spent the voyage assessing resource potential with the passionate focus of someone in love. "We don't know," Fan said simply. "But I'll offer a hypothesis in about 40 minutes, once I've finished showing you the data. And the hypothesis is uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable how?" said the filmmaker, Marisol, whose camera was running. It was always running. Tobias Renk, who had said nothing so far, looked up from his folded hands. He was a slight man, 51, with white at his temples and the expression of someone permanently in the middle of a thought. "He means philosophically uncomfortable," Tobias said. "Not merely technically. The kind of uncomfortable that makes you question what you mean when you say the word real." The room was quiet again. "Suit up," Yara said. "We land in 6 hours." They set down on the neutral zone of landmass Alpha, the gray plane, the undifferentiated matter-state region, because it was the only place the instruments could agree on how to read. The landing craft descended through thin amber clouds into air that tasted, through the recycled systems, of something metallic and faintly sweet, like copper and overripe fruit. The plane was not quite solid. It was not quite anything. The surface registered on pressure sensors as firm, and it held their weight, but when Yara crouched and pressed her gloved hand against it, the material yielded slightly, like pressing a finger into dense foam, and where her hand withdrew it left no impression. The surface simply resumed its smoothness. Its color was the precise gray of an overcast sky before snow. It had no texture under magnification. No grain, no crystal structure, no molecular irregularity. Dr. Siosea Taufa, the mission's physicist, ran 3 different spectroscopic analyses and stood up from his equipment looking as though someone had told him a joke he didn't understand. "It's not anything," Siosea said. "It's something," said Amara Solis, who had landed with the first team over Yara's mild objection. The systems theorist was crouching near Siosea, not looking at his instruments but at the surface itself, with her head tilted slightly to one side. "It's just not decided yet." "Come again." Amara stood. She was 40 years old, Nigerian-Canadian, with close-cropped hair and a habit of speaking slowly and precisely that made her sound, at first, overly deliberate, until you realized she was simply making sure every word was doing its intended job. The survey data shows that 93 days ago, this entire surface was like this. One undifferentiated neutral zone. Now 14 distinct physical regimes have developed in different areas. The question I've been modeling is, what changed? "The survey drones," said Dr. Lin Fan, the atmospheric chemist, looking up from her sample collection. She was joking, mostly. "We observed it. Quantum effect." "Larger scale," Amara said, not smiling. but not entirely wrong in spirit. Yara filed that away. She looked up at the sky, amber and vast, with 3 small moons visible even in daylight, one of them trailing a ring of pale debris, and felt the planet on the soles of her boots. Felt it yield slightly. Felt it feel her back. "First observation team, establish perimeter," she said into her comms. "Casimir, Solis, Taufa, you're with me on the walkabout. I want a half-kilometer radius survey of this zone before we go anywhere near the transition lines." "The transition lines," Osei said, looking toward the nearest zone boundary, visible as a crisp edge where the gray plane simply stopped and the crystalline spires began, about 800 meters to the east. "What do you think we'll find there?" "Different physics," Fun said, with a brightness in his voice that was either scientific excitement or controlled terror. On Fun, the two were indistinguishable. They found the transition at 0.2 kilometers before they found the line. That was the first thing that should have warned them. Yara's boots began to feel heavier. Not dramatically. She registered it as fatigue at first, mild after the landing prep stress, but Osei's instruments caught it. Local gravitational constant shifting over approximately 200 meters from 0.94 standard to 1.31 standard. By the time they stood at the transition line itself, which was exactly what it appeared to be from orbit, a clean geometric edge as straight as something drawn with a laser, they weighed a third more than they had on the ship. The crystals on the other side were extraordinary. They rose from the ground in clusters, anywhere from a meter to 2 kilometers tall, translucent deep blue fading to clear white at their peaks, faceted in a way that suggested either perfect geological formation or deliberate construction, and it was genuinely impossible to determine which. Between them, the ground was strewn with smaller formations, ankle-high hexagonal tiles of the same material arranged in interlocking patterns that extended in every direction as far as Yara could see. "Refractive index off any known material," Osei said, leaning over his instruments. "But internally consistent. Whatever this is, it follows laws, they're just not ours." Fun Casimir stepped across the transition line. The group held their breath. Fun stood on the other side, feet on the hexagonal crystal tiles, and turned back to look at them with an expression of pure wonder. "Gravity's different," he reported. "About 1.3 standard. And the light." He looked up. "The light isn't behaving right. Everything is slightly blue-shifted. Not much. Just enough to notice." Yara crossed after him. The weight hit her immediately, not painful, just notable, like wearing an extra pack. The blue shift was real. The amber sky had a faint blue-white cast on this side of the line, as though a filter had been placed over the sun. "Who built this?" whispered Lin Fan, who had followed without being invited. "Nothing we've catalogued," Fun said. "The survey drones detected no sapient life. No construction, no technology signatures, no radio emissions. Nothing." "Then what made it?" Amara Solis was standing at the transition line, half on either side, right foot in the gray zone, left foot in the crystal zone. She was looking at the ground beneath her left foot with an expression that Yara would later describe as the most complicated she'd ever seen on a human face. "I think," Amara said slowly, "that we may have made it." The hypothesis that Fawn and Amara assembled over the next 18 hours was rejected by 4 of the 6 scientists in the first hour of discussion, accepted by 1, Osei, with qualifications, and by Tobias Renk, who had not been invited to the science team's meeting but attended anyway and whose response was to close his eyes for a long time and then say, "Yes. Of course. That's what it does." The hypothesis, in its stripped form, was this. The substrate of Kepler 882b, the planetary matter itself, the rock and atmosphere and whatever comprised that gray undifferentiated plane, responded to expectation. Not to physical force. Not to chemical reaction. Not to any of the standard inputs that caused planetary surfaces to change. It responded to the expectations of conscious observers. The survey drones had no expectations. They were instruments. They measured what was there, recorded it, transmitted it. The planet, measured by instruments that expected nothing, remained in its base state, undifferentiated, neutral, potential. But the survey data had been analyzed by human beings. And human beings, receiving information about an alien planet, do what human beings do. They form mental models. They anticipate. They prepare. They imagine. A geologist reading about an amber-brown landmass thinks of sedimentary rock, thinks of familiar erosion patterns, thinks of rivers cutting canyons. A physicist reading about a 0.94 gravity world thinks of slightly reduced weight, thinks of familiar mechanics, thinks of known constants. An exobotanist reading about bioluminescent plant analogues thinks of biochemistry, thinks of cellular structures, thinks of processes they've read about in papers. 22 human beings had spent 12 months in transit reading the survey data, thinking about the planet, dreaming about it, dreaming literally, in the case of several crew members who had mentioned vivid planetary dreams in their psych check-ins, and when the Penrose entered orbit, those 22 distinct models of reality brushed up against a surface that was waiting to be told what to be. It became what they expected it to be. All of it. All 22 versions. Simultaneously. That's insane, said Mission Specialist Torres, the senior military observer, a compact woman with a scar on her chin and an expression of professional skepticism. The alternatives are equally insane, Amara said, and less coherent. You're saying the planet is, what? Psychic. I'm saying it's sensitive to information, Amara said. Like a recording medium. Film isn't psychic, but it stores light. This surface stores, she paused, choosing carefully, epistemic state. The state of being believed in. And the zones. Yara said. The 14 separate physical regimes? Each one corresponds to a dominant expectation held by one or more crew members, Fun said. He brought up a comparison on his display. Survey footage of each zone, side by side with crew psych records and hobby documentation and personal library archives. The crystalline zone corresponds to a paper published 18 months ago by a Dr. Arjun Mehta. It isn't here, but Osei downloaded it and studied it extensively before departure. The paper described a theoretical model of crystalline planetary formation following certain ionic cascade reactions. The planet built his paper. Osei was very quiet. The forest with upward rivers, Fun continued. Lynn had a recurring dream, she mentioned it in her psych logs, about water flowing the wrong direction. A childhood dream she'd had for years, about a flood running upward. The planet built her dream. The fire zone, said Torres. She did not ask it as a question. She already knew. Fun looked at her steadily. You grew up in New Caracas. You were there during the 17-day fire event in 71. Your psych record indicates post-traumatic pattern associations with open fire, particularly at night. The fire here doesn't consume. It doesn't spread. It doesn't harm. It's... He hesitated. It's your memory of fire. The emotional memory. Present but contained. Torres was very still. Her jaw was working. And the darkness zone, Yara said. She thought she already knew. Dr. Renk, Amara said, glancing at the philosopher, who sat in the corner with his fountain pen. Tobias has written extensively about the philosophical concept of radical uncertainty, the notion that beneath all observable reality lies a fundamental dark ground of pure unknowing. He'd been working on a manuscript about it for 8 years before departure. He talked about it constantly on the voyage. She looked at Tobias. Apparently, the planet found the idea compelling. Tobias said nothing. But he smiled, the small, private smile of a man who has thought about something so long that when it appears in the world, it feels less like a shock and more like a reunion. Then the moving stones, Yara said. In the basin. Mine, said Marisol Vega, the filmmaker, from behind her camera. Her voice was entirely neutral. I spent a year before departure studying an indigenous cultural tradition from the Andes, a belief that stones have slow agency. That they move toward what they love and away from what harms them. I found it beautiful. I thought about it often. She lowered her camera slightly. Apparently agreement. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which everyone is recalculating everything they thought they knew about the nature of the world. It was Tobias Renk who broke it. Plato wrote about this, he said quietly. Not about planets. Plato knew nothing of other planets. But about the relationship between thought and substance. He believed the phenomenal world was a reflection of the ideal. That chairs were chairs because they participated in the form of chairness. He looked around the room. He was wrong about the direction, perhaps. He thought mind came from world. This planet suggests the reverse is possible. He paused. Or always was. They should have been more careful. Later, Yara would audit every decision made in the first 72 hours and identify the exact moment where careful became impossible. It was hour 14, when the Penrose crew began disembarking in larger numbers, and the surface stopped accepting one belief at a time. The problem was not conflict. Not yet. The problem was proximity. On day 3, Osei crossed the transition line into the crystal zone for extended measurements and spent 6 hours there. In that time, his thinking deepened into the mathematical framework underlying the zone's physics. He was a physicist. It was unavoidable. The crystals were extraordinary, and his mind couldn't stop running calculations about their formation, their properties, their implications. When he came back across the line, the gray zone had changed. 30 meters from the line, on the neutral side, a small cluster of crystal formations had appeared. Not large, knee-high, rough-hewn, less developed than the full zone spires. But there, where nothing had been. You carried it with you, Amara said, looking at the new formations with the expression of someone watching their model confirm itself in real time. You spent 6 hours thinking about the crystals so intensely that when you came back, the neutral ground responded to your expectation before you crossed back over. I wasn't expecting crystals to appear here, Osei said. You were expecting the fundamental crystalline properties. You were carrying their mathematics in your working memory. The ground doesn't distinguish between deliberate expectation and ambient cognition. Amara crouched near one of the new formations. It reads whatever's loudest. On day 5, Torres spent 3 hours in the fire zone, beginning a systematic mapping effort. She was disciplined, the most disciplined person on the crew, possibly, and she kept her thoughts rigidly procedural, recording data, cataloging positions. But fire was fire. Memory was memory. By the time she returned to camp, the campfire they kept burning for morale purposes, a small gas-fed unit, purely recreational, had changed. It still burned at the same temperature. But the light it cast had changed quality. It was deeper orange. It flickered with a specific irregular rhythm that Torres recognized, in the part of herself she didn't discuss, as the rhythm of the fire she had watched consume 4 city blocks in New Caracas when she was 11 years old. She said nothing. She documented it. On day 7, Hendricks, the corporate liaison, who had been running resource surveys with barely concealed impatience, made a decision that Yara would later describe as the single most consequential mistake of the mission. He went to the gray zone alone. He brought his resource assessment instruments. He brought a 12-year data file on mineral extraction operations in extreme environments. He brought his expectation, deep, professional, long cultivated, the expectation of a man who had spent his career identifying what planets were worth, that Kepler 882b was a resource. A body of valuable matter waiting to be quantified and extracted. A very large, very interesting, potentially very profitable rock. He spent 4 hours on the neutral plane. When Yara found him, he was standing in the center of what had been the gray zone, and the gray zone was not gray anymore. It was threaded with what Osei's instruments identified as pyrolite-adjacent mineralogy. Not real pyrolite, not quite, but a planetary interpretation of what Hendricks' data files described as the highest-value mineral signature in the corporate database. Veins of the stuff ran in every direction through the formerly featureless plane, glowing faintly with an orange bioluminescence that the zone had apparently borrowed from the bioluminescent plant analogues elsewhere on the planet. Hendricks, Yara said. He turned. His face had the slack, dazed quality of someone who has just experienced something he hadn't anticipated and is still in the process of integrating it. It made what I was looking for, he said. I was looking for resources, and it made them. Did you touch any of it? I took a sample. Put it back. You can't put it back, Put it as close to where you found it as you can manage, Yara said, and then I need you to stop thinking about minerals. Can you do that? He stared at her. He was not a man who had ever considered the question of whether he could stop thinking about something. Probably not, he said. Then stay on the ship, Yara said. Until I tell you otherwise. She was already too late. The vein network had extended, overnight, 200 meters in every direction. At its edges it was beginning to interact with the crystal zone boundary, and where the two met, the materials were not simply coexisting, they were competing. The crystal formations near the boundary were growing, taller and more complex, as though straining to assert dominance. The pyrolite veins pushed toward them, branching and multiplying. The transition line, which had been clean and geometric, had developed a jagged quality, like a border contested by two armies drawing and redrawing their lines. "Here it begins," Tobias Renck said, appearing at her shoulder. "What begins?" "The epistemological war," he said. "What happens when two internally consistent but mutually incompatible models of reality occupy the same space?" "Philosophy," Yara said, with an edge. "Soon to be physics," Tobias said. By day 12, the planet had stopped being navigable. The neutral zone, the buffer, the base state, the ground on which they had landed, had been consumed entirely. Every square meter of it had been claimed by one belief pattern or another. The camp, which Yara had established on the neutral plane with deliberate centrality, now sat at the intersection of four competing zones that had grown to surround it, and the camp itself had begun to change. The water recycler, standard equipment, ceramic and steel and polymer, had developed a faint crystalline growth on its outer casing, blue-white and hexagonal, that Osei could not explain except to say that it was the crystal zone's local logic trying to incorporate a foreign object. The communications array, 20 meters away, had begun broadcasting at slightly irregular intervals, the signal strength fluctuating in patterns that matched, when Marisol ran a rhythm analysis, the movement patterns of the ambulatory stones in the basin. Marisol had made the observation with a kind of horrified delight and then gone very quiet. The moving stone effect had spread. Small rocks across the campsite, they'd brought samples in from various zones, standard collection protocol, had begun to reposition themselves. Not dramatically. Centimeters at a time. But by day 12, the sample collection bins had reorganized their contents in a way that corresponded to no human sorting logic. The stones had sorted themselves by some criterion that Fawn, after 3 hours of analysis, concluded was emotional salience. The rocks that had been collected by crew members with stronger emotional responses to their collection sites had clustered together. "They remember who picked them up," Fawn said. Or, the planet expresses, through these stones, the emotional state of the person who last touched them. Its encoding effect into physical proximity behavior. "That's," Lynn started. "Extraordinary," Fawn said. "I was going to say terrifying," Lynn said. The zones were spreading and competing. The crystal zone was the largest. Osei's deep engagement with its mathematics had given it structural depth, a kind of epistemic density that made it resilient against neighboring realities. The mineral vein network was expanding faster than any other zone but was also the most unstable, its internal logic thin because Hendrik's belief in it was commercial rather than scientific, more desire than understanding. Where the vein network met the crystal zone, the two ground against each other like tectonic plates, and the boundary zone between them had become genuinely dangerous, a strip of terrain roughly 40 meters wide where physical constants shifted unpredictably from step to step, where gravity changed direction mid-stride, where objects placed down were somewhere else when you looked again. "It's not combining them," Amara said, studying the boundary zone from a safe distance with instruments that could barely keep up with the readings. "It's trying to. The planet is attempting to reconcile two incompatible belief states and finding that it cannot. So it's generating a transition buffer where both are partially true and neither is stable." "What happens if the boundaries multiply?" Yara said. "If every zone starts competing?" Amara was quiet for a moment. "I've been modeling that. In a low-iteration scenario, 4 to 6 competing zones with stable internal logic, you get boundary buffers that expand until the stable zones are isolated islands surrounded by chaos margin. The chaos margin would render the planet's surface essentially unnavigable. Equipment fails unpredictably. Physical constants vary room by room." She paused. In a high-iteration scenario, 14 or more zones with active competition, the boundary buffers overlap. The stable islands disappear. The entire surface becomes chaos margin. How long to high iteration? Amara looked at her model. Then she looked at the planet around them, at the 14 zones it had already generated from 22 people's accumulated beliefs. "We're already there," she said quietly. "We've been there since day 10. On day 15, Yara found the city. She had not gone looking for it. She had been following the edge of the darkness zone, Tobias's philosophical dark ground, a circle of impenetrable shadow 3 kilometers in diameter that sat in the middle of the continent like a hole punched in the world, and she had been doing so because the darkness zone was the one area where the competing belief systems seemed to slow their expansion. Nothing from the other zones encroached on the darkness. The crystals stopped at its edge. The veins stopped. The moving stones did not enter it. Even the boundary chaos strips, which were spreading in every direction, went around the darkness zone rather than through it. Yara had a practical commander's instinct for high ground and safe harbors. The darkness zone was neither, technically, but it seemed to function as a kind of neutral attractor, a territory that nothing claimed because nothing could see into it well enough to claim it. She followed its circumference with a torch, making notes, and that was when she heard the sound. It was not language. Not quite. It was a layered, harmonic vocalization, something like the sound of multiple people humming different notes that intersected in intervals too precise to be coincidental, building into chords that resonated strangely in the chest and in the back of the skull. The sound came from inside the darkness zone, and it was steady, rhythmic, and unmistakably intentional. She called Fun, and Amara, and Tobias. Tobias arrived fastest, as though he had been expecting the call. They stood at the edge of the darkness, listening. The harmonic vocalization rose and fell in long, slow waves. Within it, if you listened carefully, Yara discovered this and reported it, and then the others heard it too, were shorter, faster threads of sound that wove through the harmonic baseline like counterpoint in a fugue. Complex, structured, unmistakably produced by minds. "We're not alone," Fun said. "The survey drones found nothing," Yara said. "The survey drones found an undifferentiated neutral zone," Amara said. "Instruments with no expectations. An entity that could modulate its apparent existence to avoid detection by neutral instruments." She stopped. Reassembled the thought. An entity that was only perceivable by minds that expected to find it. "We expected to find nothing," Yara said. "The drones expected." "The drones expected nothing," Amara said. "But we've been here 15 days. Our expectations have filled the planet. They've remade it. We've created, unintentionally, the conditions under which something that hides in the dark ground of unbelief becomes visible." Tobias had walked to the very edge of the darkness. He stood with his toes at the boundary, looking inward, his face turned toward the sound. "They've been here all along," he said. "We made them visible by populating their world with belief." The harmonics shifted. The sound moved, not randomly, but purposefully, a kind of acoustic movement that suggested approach. Something was coming toward them through the dark. What emerged from the darkness, slowly and without drama, was 4 beings. They were roughly bilateral, roughly vertical, roughly the height of a tall human being, but these approximations were the most that could be said with certainty, because nothing about them held still enough for precision. Their bodies seemed to exist in a perpetual state of slight flux, not shape-shifting, exactly, more like a living thing that was in the process of deciding which of several possible forms to settle into and had not yet committed. Their skin, if it was skin, was a deep, shifting blue-black that caught the ambient light and refracted it in patterns that had no fixed geometry, rolling across their surfaces in waves. They had no eyes that Yara could identify. They had no mouths in any fixed position. But the harmonics continued to come from them, resonating from their chests and throats and perhaps their entire surfaces, and now that they were close, Yara could feel the harmonics as a physical sensation, a vibration in her sternum that was not unpleasant. They stopped 3 meters away. The harmonic sound dropped to a low, continuous chord that felt like Yara would spend a long time trying to describe this correctly, like a question held open. "Hello," said Dr. von Casimir, in English, in his gentle way. The sound shifted. Incorporated. The chord restructured itself around the phonemes of Fun's hello as though filing the word away, processing it, finding its place in a larger pattern. "They know what we are," Tobias said. "They've known since we arrived." "How?" Yara said. "Because they built this planet," Amara said, and her voice had a quality of absolute certainty that she very rarely deployed. "Not the crystals. Not the zones. Not any of the particular things we've made it into. But the capacity. The underlying sensitivity. This is their home. They made a home that responds to consciousness. We wandered into their living room and redecorated." The 4 beings made a sound together, unified, harmonic, and modulated in a way that, even without language, communicated something that felt like assessment. The assessment of 4 minds that had been watching 22 strangers tear each other's assumptions into the planet's surface and were now, apparently, deciding what to do about it. Over the next 6 days, Tobias Renck did something remarkable. He talked to them. Not in language, not initially, and never entirely. But Tobias had spent 50 years studying the relationship between minds and meaning, and he had a quality, his most professionally irritating quality, the one that made him insufferable at faculty meetings, of treating every interlocutor as though they were his primary interest in the world. He gave the beings his full attention in the most complete sense of the phrase. He sat at the edge of the darkness zone with a notebook in his lap and listened, and when the harmonics shifted or modulated or developed new patterns, he responded not with words but with sounds, and not even really with sounds, but with something that he would later describe, inadequately, as the posture of his understanding. He shaped his attention into a response. He made his consciousness legible. The beings, who had no name, or whose name could not be rendered in phoneme-based language, and who the crew eventually referred to simply as the Belvers, which was Torres's abbreviation of believers and was meant initially as a sardonic observation but became, over time, simply true, were exquisitely sensitive to this. They read attention the way humans read expressions. They responded to the quality of a mind's engagement before they responded to any particular content. What Tobias eventually assembled from this process was not a grammar, not a lexicon, not a translation. It was more like a phenomenological map, a gradually deepening account of how the Belvers experienced reality rather than what they thought about any particular aspect of it. The Belvers experienced reality as a collective, not a hive mind. They had individual consciousness, Tobias was fairly certain of this, but they had developed, over a period of time that dwarfed human civilization, a practice of shared epistemic state. They called it something that Tobias rendered as the accord, which was not quite right, but was the closest single English word. The accord was not agreement in the political sense. It was not consensus. It was not one Belver adopting another's beliefs. It was the capacity to hold one's own model of reality in a kind of provisional transparency, to make your beliefs visible to others, not in words but in the direct material of experience, and to modify them in real-time response to the beliefs of others, not by surrendering your own view but by incorporating others' views into a larger, more complex architecture that was capable of containing both. The planet was the medium in which the accord was practiced and recorded. The Belvers had not built the surface's sensitivity. They had evolved in it. Their collective practice of transparent belief had shaped the planet's responsiveness over geological time, as a river shapes its channel, as a city shapes its bedrock. The planet was their mind's residue. Its sensitivity to consciousness was the literal impression of millions of years of the accord being practiced on its surface. They did to this planet, Tobias wrote in his notebook, in the cramped handwriting he used when he was thinking faster than he could write, what we do, in miniature, to each other's minds when we truly communicate. We change each other. We are changed. We leave marks. They simply do this at planetary scale, and the planet responds. What had disrupted this was exactly what Amara had predicted and Tobias had recognized. 22 human beings, arriving with separate and incompatible models of reality, had introduced into the Accord's medium 22 competing epistemic states held by minds that had no practice of making their beliefs transparent to each other, no tradition of the Accord, no means of resolving contradiction except by fighting or by silence. The planet had not done anything wrong. It had simply responded to all of them, equally, because it could not distinguish between a Belver practicing the Accord and a human being accidentally projecting their personal cosmology onto an alien world. What does it want from us? Yara said, when Tobias reported this. It doesn't want, Tobias said. It observes. He paused. The Belvers want. They've been watching species arrive here. Apparently they travel, or something about the Accord draws others here across whatever mechanism of attraction we don't understand yet, and they've been watching what those species do when they encounter a reality that shapes itself to their expectations. What have other species done? Tobias was quiet for a moment. Some have taken it as confirmation of their existing beliefs and become entrenched. Their zones become absolute, and when the zones compete, he stopped. And when the zones compete, Yara pressed. The chaos margin consumes the planet, Tobias said. Temporarily. The planet recovers its base state after the conscious beings are no longer present to sustain the belief patterns. But the beings do not survive the chaos margin. The silence in the room had a specific weight. We're in the chaos margin, Torres said. She was not asking. We have been for 5 days, Amara confirmed. I've been watching it expand. We have roughly 12 days before it reaches a saturation threshold at which the instability becomes self-sustaining even without our presence. At that point, she stopped. At that point what? said Hendricks, who had been sitting in the back of every meeting since the minerals had appeared, with the expression of a man who has been experiencing an extremely unpleasant education. At that point, the planet's surface will be generating its own contradictions, Amara said. The competing belief patterns will have become complex enough to sustain themselves independently. A kind of epistemic self-sustaining reaction. The chaos margin will be the permanent state. Not temporary. Permanent. And we'll be in it, Torres said. Everyone will be in it, Amara said. Including the Belvers. The meeting to discuss options lasted 11 hours and ended without resolution. The options, as Amara laid them out with the calm of someone delivering a diagnosis, were 3. First, leave. Immediately. Abandon the mission, return to the Penrose, break orbit. If they left quickly enough and the chaos margin had not yet reached saturation, the planet's base state might recover. But the timeline was uncertain, and there was no guarantee. And leaving meant leaving without understanding, without data, without the contact they had accidentally achieved with the Belvers, without any of the scientific and philosophical knowledge that this encounter might yield. Second, attempt to reinforce individual belief zones. Concentrate effort on deepening the coherence of individual zones, making each zone stable enough that the competition with neighboring zones stabilized at its current boundaries rather than expanding. This was the approach Torres was quietly, professionally in favor of, not because she thought it was right, but because it was the most controllable, the most familiar, the most like a defensive strategy she could execute. Its problem, as Amara modeled it, was that deeper individual belief coherence made the boundary conflicts more violent, not less. Two armies with reinforced positions did not fight less fiercely. Third, the Accord. What Tobias described as the third option, and what the Belvers had apparently been waiting for, with the patience of a species that had been practicing patience for geological time periods, was the possibility that the 22 human beings could do something no other visiting species had managed to do, hold their individual beliefs simultaneously while making them collectively transparent. Not agree on a single reality. The Belvers were not asking that. They did not believe in the possibility of a single reality, and their entire civilization was built on the understanding that multiple realities could be simultaneously true if held in sufficiently transparent accord. What they were asking, what the planet required, what the chaos margin demanded, was that each person become genuinely, vulnerably aware of every other person's belief model. Not accept it. Not adopt it. Simply see it. Hold it in awareness alongside your own. That's impossible, said Hendricks. It's very difficult, Tobias said. I don't know if it's impossible. It's a philosophical exercise, Torres said. You can't run a planetary physics intervention on a philosophical exercise. We've been running a planetary physics intervention on 22 separate philosophical assumptions for 15 days, Tobias said. The question is simply whether we can be as effective at the Accord as we have been at the Discord. Can the Belvers help? Yara said. Yes, Tobias said. They're offering to. That's what they've been doing, sitting outside the darkness zone each day, since day 16. Waiting. Not intervening. They won't intervene without consent. Apparently that's a foundational axiom of the Accord, but present. Available. Available for what, exactly? Said Fawn. To teach us what transparency feels like, Tobias said. To model it. To do for us, on a small scale, what they do for each other continuously. To show us what our beliefs look like from outside our own heads. He paused. I've been practicing something like it with them for 6 days. I can tell you it is profoundly uncomfortable and also unlike anything I've ever experienced. Uncomfortable how? Yara asked. He thought about this carefully. Have you ever had a conversation with someone who, unexpectedly, said something that made you realize you'd been holding a belief you didn't know you had? Something you'd assumed so deeply you never examined it? The moment of, not embarrassment, but something adjacent to it. Exposure. The feeling of having been seen at the level of your assumptions. He looked around the room. That feeling. Continuously. Shared mutually. For 22 people simultaneously. He paused again. The Belvers have been doing this their entire lives. It's ordinary for them. The way sharing a language is ordinary for us. We barely notice we're doing it. For them, sharing the shape of their beliefs is just, he opened his hands. Tuesday. The silence was different this time. More interior. It was Marisol who spoke first, from behind her camera, which had not moved from her shoulder since day 3. "I'll do it," she said. "I've been watching all of us for 15 days, trying to document something I couldn't name. I think that might be what I've been trying to do, make our interior states visible. In a way, it's just what I've been doing anyway." She lowered the camera for the first time. With worse equipment. Tobias led them to the edge of the darkness on day 17 at dawn, and the 4 Belvers were already there. More Belvers emerged during the session. By the end there were 11, sitting at the rim of the darkness in their characteristic posture, which was not sitting exactly, but a kind of settled verticality, their surfaces rippling slowly with the bioluminescent patterns that Tobias had identified as their equivalent of an open, receptive expression. The practice was simple to describe and nearly impossible to execute. You sat with your belief. You examined it, not academically, not at the level of propositions or arguments, but at the level of felt certainty. The way things felt true. The weight of your convictions in your chest. The texture of your expectations about how the world worked. The deep background assumptions that structured everything you perceived. And then, this was the part that required the Belver's assistance, because humans had no natural practice of it, no evolved capacity for it, you made that felt quality available. You offered it outward. Not the ideas. Not the propositions. Not the arguments. The feel of believing it. The Belvers did this by harmonic resonance. Their bodies were literally instruments for it, broadcasting the quality of their epistemic state in frequencies that other Belvers could receive and interpret. Humans had nothing equivalent, or almost nothing. What they had, what Tobias had been developing, imperfectly, for 6 days, was attention. The quality of a mind's full, undivided, vulnerability-accepting attention. It was not comfortable. He had been right about that. On the first day of the practice, 3 people could not maintain it for more than 10 minutes. Lynn cried without knowing why and had to step away. Torres maintained it for 45 minutes and then stood up with the controlled precision of someone managing a serious shock and walked 300 meters from the group and stood looking at the horizon until she came back, 20 minutes later, and sat back down without comment. Hendricks, whom Yara had been mentally writing off as the mission's primary liability, sat through the full 2-hour session and at the end of it said, to no one in particular, in a voice stripped of all his professional coating, "I didn't know I was afraid." He didn't explain what he was afraid of, and nobody asked, because everybody in the group had their own version of the same sentence active in their chests. What happened to the planet during the practice was subtle on day 17 and more visible each day after. The chaos margin stopped expanding. First it slowed, then it stopped. The boundary conflicts between zones began to show signs of what Osei described as acoustic resonance between competing wave functions, a technical description for the observed phenomenon that the zones were, very slowly, beginning to harmonize rather than clash. Not merge. Not surrender to each other. Harmonize. The way 2 musical notes that were previously dissonant could shift fractionally and become an interval that contained both. By day 21, the crystal zone and the mineral vein zone had developed, at their boundary, a strip of terrain unlike either of them, not chaos margin, but something new. A third kind of ground that combined the crystalline structure with something of the mineral veins' organic sprawl, forming structures that were simultaneously geometric and living seeming, that grew in directions that obeyed both systems' internal logic by discovering that the 2 logics, held in transparency next to each other, shared certain foundational symmetries that neither had expressed alone. The planet, Amara said, was computing the accord. On day 23, Osei Taufa made the discovery that changed the shape of everything. He had been running continuous spectroscopic analysis of the planet's base material, the stuff beneath all the zones, the undifferentiated substrate that the neutral plane had been made of, and on day 23 his instruments registered something that he had been filtering out as instrument error for 9 days, because it was too regular to be noise and too strange to be signal. The base material of Kepler 882b was not inert. It was not passive, not merely receptive, not simply a blank medium waiting to be written on by conscious minds. It was active. It was producing a low-level field effect that Osei, after 8 hours of increasingly frantic analysis, identified as something with no current name in the literature, a field that propagated the mathematical structure of information between objects in contact with the planetary surface. "It's not just recording our beliefs," he said, at the emergency meeting that same night, with the expression of a man delivering news that he has not yet fully accepted himself. "It's relaying them. to other minds on the surface, filtered through its own base-state mathematics. He paused. The planet it is not a passive medium. It's an active participant in cognition. Every conscious being standing on the surface is, without knowing it, thinking partly with the planet. The planet is thinking partly with them. The implications arrived in the room in waves, like ripples from something dropped in still water. The accord, Tobias said slowly. The Belvers didn't develop the accord for the planet. They developed it with the planet. The planet taught them. Or they co-developed it, each modifying the other over time. Like a language and its speakers, Amara said. Exactly. And when we arrived, Yara said, we didn't just bring our beliefs to a neutral medium. We were plugged in, Osei said. Immediately. On landing. The field effect begins operating the moment a conscious being makes sustained contact with the surface. We've been thinking with the planet since our boots touched down. He stopped. Everything we've believed here, we've believed with the planet's active involvement. It's not a substrate. It's a collaborator. That means, Torres said carefully, that the chaos margin isn't just a reflection of our conflicting beliefs. It's the planet's own confusion, Finn said. It's caught between incompatible collaborators. He stopped. Looked at Tobias. It's in distress. The word landed in the room with unexpected weight. Distress. The planet was in distress. The accord, Yara said. The reason it works, the reason the Belvers practice it, it's not just for their own benefit. It's planetary health, Amara said. The accord is the cognitive practice that keeps their collaborative partner, the planet, the substrate, the field, in stable operation. It's a kind of hygiene. A kind of care. She looked at the planet's surface through the base's observation window. We've been making it sick. The darkness zone pulsed, once, gently, like a slow heartbeat. The harmonics from inside it swelled briefly, then returned to their baseline. The Belvers were listening. They were always listening. Day 24. The chaos margin had not retreated, but it had stabilized. The saturation threshold was close. Amara calculated 4 days, with error bars that made her uncomfortable but that she reported accurately because she was, like all of them at this point, past the point of softening bad news. They practiced the accord for 7 hours. All 22 of them, including Hendricks, including Torres who sat with her eyes closed and her hands flat on her thighs and whatever fire was inside her burning steadily and transparently for the first time in her adult life, including Marisol whose camera sat on the ground beside her and used, including the 2 military observers who had been minimally present through most of the mission and who now sat with expressions of concentrated effort, like people who have been asked to do something, requiring muscles they didn't know they had. The Belvers, there were 23 of them now, enough to surround the human group in a loose circle, did something they had not done before. They harmonized with the human group instead of independently. The shift was subtle at first. The baseline chord the Belvers maintained changed frequency slightly, tuning itself to the collective cognitive state of the humans, which was not a chord but a tangle, 22 different felt certainties and uncertainties pulling in 22 directions, a noise floor rather than a signal. But the Belvers held the tangle in their harmonics with the equanimity of musicians who can hear the melody inside a cacophony. They played back not the noise but the structure underlying it. What Yara experienced during this, what she would spend a long time trying to describe accurately, was something like seeing a room she had lived in her entire life from the outside for the first time. Her beliefs, her operational certainties, the ground of her cognition, were suddenly legible to her as beliefs in a way they had never been before. She had known, intellectually, that she was a product of her experience and culture and training. But knowing something intellectually and feeling its contingency from the inside simultaneously were not the same thing. She felt, for approximately 11 seconds, the full weight of what it meant that her reality was a model, a very good model, carefully constructed, functionally reliable, and not reality itself. And in that 11 seconds, she felt the other 21 models in the room. Not in detail. Not in content. In texture. The quality of Torres's disciplined certainty, held at enormous psychic cost. The quality of Fun's delighted openness, genuinely permeable to surprise. The quality of Hendricks's professional conviction, a shell built over something younger and more frightened. The quality of Osei's mathematical rapture, a form of belief as clean and self-consistent as the crystal zone it had made. The quality of Marisol's observational suspension, the belief of someone who had trained herself to defer her own certainties in favor of what was actually in front of her, which was, Yara realized, the closest human analog to the accord that any of them had developed independently. The chaos margin contracted. Not dramatically, not instantly, but perceptibly. The boundary conflicts reduced their intensity. The competing zone edges pulled back fractionally from each other. The planet's confusion, its distress, eased by some degree that was not measurable in numbers but was immediately felt by everyone on the surface, human and Belver alike. "Hold it," Tobias said, very quietly. "Hold what you're feeling. Don't move away from it." Nobody moved away from it. Not for another 4 hours. On day 26, 2 days before Amara's threshold estimate, Yara walked into the darkness zone. She went alone at midday without telling anyone, which was a violation of every protocol she had established and which she would defend, afterward, only by saying that she had known, not thought, known, that it was the right time and that she needed to do it alone. The darkness was complete within 2 steps of the boundary. Not the darkness of night, which is merely an absence of visible light, but leaves infrared and audio and proprioception intact. This was a darkness that operated at a more fundamental level. It suspended, gently but absolutely, the informational field from the outside world. Her instruments gave no readings. Not because they were broken, they registered as functioning. They simply had nothing to measure, because inside the darkness, the planet's field effect was not absent but turned inward. The planet was thinking about itself in here. It was, she understood with a clarity that arrived without words, the place where the planet's own cognition lived when it wasn't engaged with the beings on its surface. It was the planet's private mind. She stood in it for a long time. She couldn't say how long because her timekeeping failed without external reference points. She stood and she breathed and she practiced the accord as well as she could, alone, which was to say, she made herself as transparent as she could manage and waited. What came was not an experience she could translate into language, and she would spend the rest of her life trying and produce 12 essays, none of which satisfied her, and a short poem that she showed only to Tobias, who read it once and said, "Yes. Approximately. That's the best that language can do." But in the non-linguistic terms in which it arrived, it was something like this. The planet was not testing them. It was not malicious, not strategic, not running an experiment with them as subjects. It was simply doing what it had always done, responding to consciousness with total honesty. It had no capacity for deception. It could not pretend to be something it wasn't, because its nature was to be whatever consciousness brought to it, not by abandoning itself, but by finding, in its base-state mathematics, the version of itself that was in honest response to what was present. Other species had come. Other species had found, in this capacity, a mirror, a perfect, generous mirror that showed them their own beliefs at planetary scale. And other species, seeing themselves at planetary scale, had been unable to resist. They had reinforced what they saw. They had mistaken the reflection for discovery, for evidence that they had been right all along, that their model of reality was the model of reality, that the universe confirmed them. And in their certainty, they had torn the planet apart. The Belvers survived here because they had learned, or co-evolved, or been taught by the planet itself, the direction of causation was not clearly linear, that the most honest response to a reality-responsive world was not a stronger belief but a more transparent one. Not the certainty that you were right but the willingness to be seen being wrong. The planet was not a test in the sense of a pass-or-fail evaluation. But it was, in the sense of a diagnostic inquiry, a question posed to each species that arrived. Can you see yourself? Can you hold your truth as a truth, rather than as the truth? Can you love your model of reality clearly enough to know what it is, a model, and not what it claims to be? Most species couldn't. The chaos margin was what happened when they couldn't. Yara came out of the darkness. Her instruments resumed their readings. The amber sky was above her, and the planet's surface was beneath her feet, and the Belvers were sitting at the edge of the darkness in their circle, and they were looking at her with their eyeless faces and their rippling surfaces, and she understood, not in language but in the same direct register in which she had understood everything inside the dark, that they were pleased. Not pleased with her specifically. Pleased with the direction. "How much time do we have?" she said aloud, though there was nobody within earshot. The darkness pulsed behind her. A soft, single pulse, like a heartbeat, steady and deep. 12 days, she understood. Enough. They practiced for 3 days continuously. Not 7 hours. Not 8. Continuously, in shifts, maintaining an unbroken collective presence of at least 15 people at a time, with the others sleeping in short rotations and returning. The Belvers did not sleep, or their equivalent of sleep was something that occurred in a maintenance state still present in the circle. They held the collective field through every rotation, every gap, with the practiced ease of beings who had been doing this for eons. On the third day, day 29, the chaos margin began to genuinely retreat. It was Lin who saw it first. She had been tracking the boundary conditions from the camp's instruments for the entire mission, and on the morning of day 29, she looked at her data and then looked at the planet around her and then started to laugh. Not a hysterical laugh. The laughter of someone whose instrument has finally confirmed what their intuition had been telling them, and the relief is enormous. The zones were not disappearing. They were not merging. They were not homogenizing into a single unified reality. They were learning to be adjacent. The crystal zone and the mineral vein zone had developed that new transitional territory. More of it now, more developed, richer. The fire zone and the moving stone zone had developed a boundary region where the stones moved in patterns that corresponded to the fire's rhythm, as though the stones were dancing in slow geological time to a music they could feel through the ground. The darkness zone and the forest zone, the one with upward rivers, Lin's childhood dream, had developed something at their boundary that neither Lin nor Tobias could fully account for, a grove of luminescent plants that glowed in the color spectrum of the darkness, whose root systems reached toward each other through the soil in patterns that looked, under magnification, like the notation system the Belvers used in their harmonics. The planet was writing. It was recording what it had learned. It was making permanent, in its material, the record of 22 minds discovering how to hold their realities in accord with each other and with its own deep cognition. "It's incorporating us," Amara said, watching the instruments. "Not consuming us. Incorporating. We're in its record now. Alongside every other species that came here." She paused. "The ones that made it, anyway." "The ones that didn't," Torres said. "Where are they in the record?" "The chaos margin scars," Amara said quietly. "There are areas on the planet, not on these continents, but visible in the orbital data, that I couldn't explain at first. Large-scale terrain disruptions. Geological impossibilities. I thought they were natural. They're not." She looked at her screen. "They're epitaphs. They stayed for 91 days. Not because the mission required it, and not because they had resolved everything. They hadn't, and they knew they hadn't, and that knowing was itself a kind of resolution. They stayed because leaving felt like it would be a kind of rudeness, a premature departure from a conversation that was still, in ways none of them could fully articulate, in progress. Tobias stayed longest at the edge of the darkness each day, filling notebook after notebook with observations that he wrote in his cramped private hand and that he shared with the Belvers by the simple method of reading aloud while they listened, and what they made of the words he couldn't entirely say, but their harmonics changed while he read and returned to baseline when he stopped, and he treated this as a form of dialogue that was as real as any he'd conducted in his professional life. Torres, on day 64, did something she had not done in many years. She walked to the fire zone alone, stood at its edge, and crossed the boundary. She sat in the fire that did not burn for 2 hours. She came back and said nothing about it to anyone, but when she sat down for the next accord session, something in the texture of her felt certainty had changed. Not reduced, not defeated, but unguarded in a way it hadn't been before. The group felt it immediately, and the Belvers' harmonics shifted to acknowledge it, a brief chord that expressed something Tobias could only approximate as welcome home. Hendricks, on day 71, formally renounced his resource survey. He documented this in an official transmission to Kepler Consolidated Resources that included the sentence, "The value of this planet is not extractable and its attempt would not constitute extraction but erasure," which was the most precise thing he had said in 12 years of corporate work. He was later dismissed from the company, which he described as a relief that he hadn't known he needed. Osei published a preliminary paper from the ship's transmitter, a compressed, dense, technically extraordinary paper on what he called belief-responsive material states, that landed in the Earth academic community like something dropped from an enormous height. The responses ranged from incredulous to electrified. He responded to all of them personally. Marisol shot 240 hours of footage. She assembled a 3-hour documentary from it that was, in her view, the worst and most important film she had ever made, because it was honest about how much it couldn't show, how much of what had happened on Kepler 882b was not visible to instruments, not captured by lenses, not compressible into images and sound, but existed in a register that was purely, irreducibly experiential. The film's final sequence was 11 minutes of Marisol's own face, unsteady handheld footage of herself sitting at the Accord session, and when you watched it closely, if you knew what you were looking for, you could see on her face, fractional, barely legible, but real, the expression of someone who is being seen. On the morning of day 91, 2 hours before departure, Tobias Renck sat at the edge of the darkness one final time. He had his notebook and his fountain pen, and he wrote for 45 minutes, and when he was done he read what he had written to the Belvers in his quiet, precise voice. Their harmonics held steady throughout, a single open chord like a held breath. He wrote, "The question this world asks, that every world like this one asks, if there are others, which I now believe there are, is not, what is true? It has no interest in that question. It has already answered that question in the only way it can be answered, which is, everything is true that any consciousness believes fully enough to project into matter. Everything. The crystal towers. The upward rivers. The fire that does not burn. The darkness at the bottom of thought. The question it asks is simpler and harder. Can you hold your truth as a truth? Can you love what you believe clearly enough to see it for what it is, a window, not a wall? Can you press your face to your own certainties and know them as the glass, not the landscape? Most minds can't. The ones that can't take the planet apart. We nearly did. We came prepared to find a planet and found instead the shape of our own minds at scale, and we nearly couldn't survive the sight. What saved us wasn't agreement. We don't agree. We won't. Osei sees a universe of crystalline mathematics and Torres sees a universe of fire contained by will and Marisol sees a universe observed into meaning and I see a universe of fertile darkness underneath all certainty, and none of us is wrong, and none of us is wholly right, and the planet has written all of us into its surface and the writing is richer for the variety, not poorer. What saved us was the willingness to let the others see what we saw. The willingness to be a window instead of a wall. The Belvers have practiced this for so long that they no longer experience it as a discipline. For them it is simply perception, the natural way minds exist in a world that responds to them. They cannot imagine being otherwise. For us it required 29 days of concentrated effort and the near destruction of an ancient, extraordinary, living world. I don't know if we'll do better next time. I don't know if there will be a next time. I don't know if what we've learned here survives the transit back to Earth and the re-immersion in a world that does not visibly respond to our beliefs and therefore lets us pretend we're only having them privately. But I know this, the planet is still here. We did not destroy it. The chaos margin retreated. The zones are learning to be neighbors. And in its surface, permanently, in the material that the Belvers have been writing in for geological time. We are here too. 22 small, limited, frightened, brilliant, inconsistent minds that almost broke everything and instead, at the last possible moment, found the courage to be legible to each other. The planet asked its question. We did not answer it cleanly. We did not answer it beautifully. But we answered it. He closed his notebook. The harmonics from the darkness rose briefly, not to a crescendo, nothing dramatic, but to a fullness of chord that contained every frequency the Belvers had used across the 91 days, assembled once into a single, complete expression that lasted approximately 8 seconds. It was, Tobias thought, the closest thing to a statement of fact he had heard since landing. Not agreement. Not applause. Something more fundamental. Recognition. 43 years later, a second mission arrived at Kepler, 882b. They found 14 zones, the same 14, more developed, more complex, richer at their boundaries, and they found the Belvers, and they found, in the surface of the neutral plane where the first mission had landed, a formation of crystalline material in the precise arrangement of 22 distinct geometric signatures, each one different, each one corresponding to no known geological process, each one permanent and legible and strange. They found a record of 22 people who had come, afraid, and left, changed. The second mission carried 41 people. They had read Tobias Renck's final report. They had practiced, in transit, for 12 months. They were not ready, no species is ever fully ready, but they arrived transparent. And the planet, which had been waiting in its base state for 43 years, patient as geology, gentle as deep time, began, once again, to respond. The universe is not indifferent to what you believe. It has simply been waiting, with vast and inexhaustible patience, for you to believe it with your eyes open.